Good morning. All right, before we start this morning, I've asked Tim if he would lead us in a word of prayer.
Gracious God and Father, we come to you this time thankful to you, Father, for the night rest. This day that you've given to fellowship, Father, and restoring you and providing for us. Father, we are most blessed to have the opportunity to study the Word. And later today, we are given life to that time to gather on the table with the members of your Son. We ask, Father, if we engage in this study as Adam leads us, that our hearts will be open. We seek to see what's in your word, Father, and use it in our lives to be more what you have us to be, more like your Son. Lord, continue to let us live by this word. Please be with us in this study, be with Adam and leads us. And again, help us with our hearts and minds open to hear your words and to use in our lives. That's what we pray.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Tim. All right, you can turn over to Mark chapter 15. That's where we're going to pick up this morning. A couple things here as we start before we get into the text. One is Don just handed me some detail about the spring quarter. So we're down to the last week of this quarter. We got today and Wednesday night, and that's it for this quarter. So new quarter will start next Sunday. The adult classes for the next quarter, there will be 2 new classes. Study on Hebrews will be in the auditorium, and the classroom in the back will be studying about finding Jesus in the Old Testament, that's pretty relevant. We've done a fair amount of that in this study. So those are your 2 options for the spring. So sure we're looking forward to that quarter. I mentioned we've got 2 classes left. I think we're going to get through the book here. Steve's going to finish us up Wednesday night because I'm going to be out of town, so I'm sure he'll rush through if that's what it takes. We'll get through here. But I just wanted to say, this is my last time teaching. I really enjoyed this quarter. You know, this auditorium class has a little bit of a reputation, and you guys have bucked that reputation in terms of participation levels and willingness to make comments and that sort of thing. It's been really encouraging to me and Steve to see how many folks are preparing in advance of the class. That's obvious based on some of the comments, and willingness to share your perspective in the class. Really been encouraging. So I just wanted to say thanks for that as the quarter comes to an end. Gail? I'm not asking for comments yet. This is an example of participating in. Go ahead, Gail.
I'll tell you how good you were.
Thank you.
As this class draws to a close, one of my favorite times of the year is the summer series. And this year's summer series is Just Who Is This Jesus?
Good.
And so we in this class have studied it all our lives, but if you look at statistics, there are a lot of people out there in this world that have no idea what you're talking about,
Yep.
or what the Bible's saying, because they've never read the Bible and never heard anybody discuss it.
Yep.
So it is a real challenge is to get the word beyond the 4 walls here and tell just who is Jesus. So I think the world needs to know.
A good plug for the summer series. That's a great opportunity to do just that. So thank you, Gail. Thank you for that. And the other thing I was going to mention is toward the end of class, I'm going to try to save 10 minutes or so for this. We'll see if that works. But I thought it might be good for us to take a step back as we near the end of the book and have the class tell us what you're taking out of this study. So what theme did you latch onto as we went through the book, or what key teaching of Jesus were you really impressed with, or what connection to Isaiah did you see as we were going through this that maybe you hadn't really thought of before? Just any sort of observation or something that leaves you with an impression as we near the end of the class. So I wanted to mention that up front just to have you kind of noodle in that a little bit as we go through the study. I don't want to distract you with that. I'm sure most of you have something that just jumped to mind. That's all I'm looking for. So just make a mental note of it, file it away. In the last 10 minutes or so, I've asked either Roy or Jacob or somebody if they wouldn't mind to run a mic Normally we haven't been doing that, but I thought that was worth making sure that everybody heard what everybody else was saying. I don't know if any of you have listened to any of the class replays online, but the new microphone system is working really well. When you listen to the replays online, you can hear just about every comment from anybody, no matter where they're sitting. But when you're sitting in this auditorium, you still can't hear from one side to the other. So that's the only reason I was going to ask them to run mics for that piece. So that's not meant to discourage participation. Hopefully it won't scare you off. Don't be worried about the mic. Just turn it off and talk real loud if that scares you or whatever. But we'll do that toward the end of the class. So just be thinking about that as we come to a close here. All right. So with that, we will get back into the text. As I mentioned, Mark chapter 15. Just by way of quick review, where some things that have transpired leading up to this. We'll pick up in verse 33 or so. Although I know Steve covered this really quickly Wednesday night, I wanted to circle back to a couple things there. But we know that Jesus has been tried by the Jewish leaders. They've convened in the middle of the night and condemned him for his claims to be the Messiah and lots of false accusations they're making toward him. We're coming right off of Peter's denial of Jesus, which Jesus predicted, and we saw that come true. The disciples have sort of all scattered like sheep, as it says. They've been running for their lives, and from a strictly human perspective, it looks like everything's falling apart. Nothing seems to be going right, but as has been mentioned in the last couple of classes, this is all going exactly to God's foreknowledge and His plan. Of course, the people who were in that situation sure did not realize that, but we looking back on it can see that this was all coming to fruition exactly as God has planned. Nothing's going wrong at all. This is exactly what God wanted to happen. And remember, I think we pointed out the verse over in Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 10 that says it was the will of the Lord to crush him. So this is all happening just as God told us it would. We're now coming to the point, or we're at the point, maybe just past the point, where Mark is really fully developing this picture that in order to be a disciple, you've got to carry the King's cross. And we've literally seen the King carrying his cross, and then Simon carrying it further. But this is the picture of discipleship that Jesus has been painting all through the book. Jesus is, on this road to the cross, the shame, the mockery that comes with it. He is the King. If he is subjected, as his disciples should expect to be subjected to something similar. So now we get down to verse 33, and we come to Jesus' last words. So let's just quickly reread verses 33 through 41, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Mark 15, verse 33 says, "And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani,' which means, 'My God, why have you forsaken me?' And some of the bystanders hearing it said, 'Behold, he is calling Elijah.' And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, 'Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down.' And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, 'Truly this man was the Son of God.' There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James the younger, of Joseph, and Salome. And when he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem." All right, so I know you talked about this a little bit Wednesday night, but as I listened to the class and then debriefed with Steve quickly, he recognized, and I noticed that really didn't spend much time talking about last words of Jesus and what they point to, what they mean, don't mean. I know we could probably spend 3 classes talking about this, so at some point I'll try to move us on. But I at least wanted to circle back to that and just mention a couple of things. One is, when we think about this phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Where you've got the cross reference here. Where do we see that phrase show up? What's Psalm 22? seems to be the clear connection here that Jesus is referring back to. So if you want to, you can hold your finger in Mark 15 or 15 and turn back to Psalm 22. We'll look at that in just a minute, because I think, rather than think about this as, this is my opinion, by the way, you're welcome to argue with this. Rather than think about this as one-off statement that Jesus is making in agony on the cross, I think we should think about it as he's pointing them back to Psalm 22. It's not you don't just take this phrase all by itself. I think when those around him heard this, they should have thought back to Psalm 22, and it really should be the whole chapter and that whole message that's in Psalm 22. That I think if you think about it that way, that gives you a little bit different flavor on what this means. Because the question that we all ask ourselves when we read this is, did God really forsake Jesus on the cross? Did he turn his back on Jesus? Well, if you just look at that phrase, how would you answer that? Yeah, I mean, if you just take it by itself, that's exactly how you would interpret that. But if you look back at Psalm 22, I think you get a little bit different impression of what he's saying here, and we'll do that. Before we do that, Jesus had said, this is not in Mark, but I'll reference it. John chapter 16, verse 32. You don't have to flip there, but I'll read it to you. Jesus said, "Behold, the hour is coming, indeed it has come, when you will be scattered, each to his own home, and will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me." So we've heard Jesus say that the Father is with him. And then he makes this statement on the cross. So I think it's worth going back to Psalm 22. And we see this, my God, why have you forsaken me?" right at the start of Psalm 22 in verse 1. So that's the reference. But I'll quickly take us through a couple things in the text there, and then we'll just pause and let people make observations about this. But as you move deeper into that chapter, in verse 6, we read, "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. And all who see me mock me. They make mouths at me, they wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord, let him deliver, let him rescue him, for he delights in him." And then as you move down to verse 14 or so, 14, it says, "I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count on my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." So everything we see here in these verses, we see happening to Jesus during the crucifixion. But as you keep moving, I think it continues to paint the full picture. Go down to verse 19 or so. It says, "But you, O Lord, do not be far off. O you, my help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion." So there in the psalm, David is noting that the Lord is listening. He's asking him to come to his aid. He's praying for salvation. And then in verse 21 or so, you see that God does answer him. He says, David says, "You have rescued me from the horns of the wild oxen. I will tell of your name to my brothers in the midst of the congregation. I will praise you," etc. We'll stop the reading there. But when you read the whole chapter, by the time you get to verse 21, I think you see that even David is saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When you get to 21, you see that God hasn't totally forsaken him. So I think that's the message of the quote there, that when Jesus is nearing his last breath, when he says that, I think we have to consider the whole context and not just take that one statement all by. Pause there, and we can debate this. Tim, go ahead.
And I think the other piece of this is we read that he's a man and God at the same time. He's suffering, terrible. And we know that he's going to give up his life. We're not going to take it.
Right.
But he can be saying that from this perspective also. Number one, it's a teaching moment for these Jews. They better go read what it says.
Yep.
It's clear.
Yep.
You have to do this. But I would suggest that he feels emotionally forsaken because he's going through this, but he knows that it's hard to follow.
He knows. Right.
And we go through that same trial in our lives.
Right.
You know it's true, yet you've got to go through something very painful.
Right. Yep.
faces that on a regular basis.
Right.
So we see it from two perspectives. We rely on the truth of God's word and also hope that they'll hear and respond to what they find out is true, not what they think is true.
Yep. No, it's a great point. We got to remember that he is fully God, but he is fully human, and he very well may have felt for, even though, to your point, he knew that he wasn't forsaken, which I think is part of why he said this. He knew Psalm 22, I'm sure, so he knew how that ended, but I'm sure from a human perspective, he did feel forsaken at that point. That doesn't mean God had forsaken him, but I think both of those can be true. He could have felt that in the moment and also known that it wasn't really. Yep. What else? What other comments about this section? Not just about that, by the way. There's other stuff here with the curtain being torn and that sort of thing. Any other observations from this? But which, by the way, on that, does that phrase ring a bell? This goes way back. Torn. The curtain was torn from top to bottom. Anybody remember where we've seen that? That torn. It's the same word in Mark. Remember back at Jesus' baptism, what did it say happened to the heavens? The heavens were torn open, and the presence of God was coming out of that. This, to me, it sort of conjures up that same thing. The temple curtain was being torn at this point as well. What else?
Hebrews 9 and 10 seem to paint that's the most holy, the curtain that separated the most holy, which no one can enter except once a year. Now that's torn, and Jesus has entered on our behalf.
Very good. Yeah, I think that's clearly the symbolism that's going on here is that wall of partition has now been broken down. And it's not just the high priest who can enter that space anymore. What else?
I think in the very last
Yep.
part of this chapter, it talks about women. These women were even named.
Yep.
And I think you've got to remember the culture of that day when they were women, because they were not in the highest level of life and all like that.
Yep.
But I think you also have to understand that every person in God's kingdom is important. Every person has a role. And these women have a role in the kingdom.
Absolutely. And we're going to see them show up again at the start of chapter 16. Yep, going to the tomb. And I don't know, I was thinking about this in verse 40. It says there were women looking on from a distance. I don't know. I have no idea how far away they would have been, although I think we have evidence that Jesus was speaking to some of them. They must have been close enough to hear him speak. But, when I read that, at least they're there. I don't know exactly what from a distance means, but we've been told before that a lot of the other ones ran away altogether. They're probably not even in the area. At least these women were following along. They were still with him.
And they later on were at the foot of the cross.
That's right. Yep. What else? Anything else in this section? Yeah, Bob.
I think it's interesting from the physical, the human standpoint of it. When Jesus alluded in the garden where if this has to happen, he prayed that if there was another way. But he stuck to it. He knew he had to go through
Yep.
it. And the other thing was when they tried to give him the wine and to deaden the pain, he didn't want to go through it partially inebriated or having that pain diluted, where he needed to go through it 100%, and he was consistent in all that he did. And I think that, although a human being, and it was hard to do that, to endure the pain that he suffered, he went through it like that.
And he suffered every bit of it.
He
Yep.
gave his all.
Yep. Good point. Anything else here, Dan?
Yeah, this is an interesting passage because this utterance of Jesus on the cross, we don't get too many that are directly, I think this is the only one in the New Testament
Yep.
And so there's a lot of, it has caused a lot of discussion around it. But it's interesting because at the same time, we go back to Psalm 22 and we read about, how, which is a dual fulfillment, prophecy of David
Right.
and Song of David. But we see that clearly David was in a similar situation. He felt forsaken
Yep.
at the time. But then, around that same version when you're talking, around verse 21, I think he said, he starts remembering in the past how God had always saved him. God had always been there for him. Similar thing here on the
Yep.
cross with Jesus. God clearly approved of Jesus' work.
Right.
God clearly set the plan in order for this to happen. So, does a father permanently forsake a son for fulfilling his own
Right.
plan? Obviously not. The other question is, was there something temporarily going on here? Yes, there was, clearly, because we see that Galatians 5 or Galatians 3 talks about how Christ became a curse for us, and how I think in 2 Corinthians 5 it says that he died in our place.
Right.
And so clearly there is a separation, at least temporarily, from the Father. And maybe that's what Jesus was saying on the cross. Out of his pain and desperation, who knows that this has been debated, especially in recent years, a lot more than it used to be. But clearly God approved of this, and it was the plan for him to become a curse, because we used to live under a curse. Now we don't. So he took that.
Yep. He did take that place. I'll probably just leave that there because I'm not sure I quite see the became a curse, became sin for us quite as clearly as you're seeing it there. But I'll probably, yeah. I have a hard time believing that Jesus became sin and was still the perfect sacrifice on our behalf. So that's where I have trouble with taking that all the way there. But I think your point of I should have mentioned this early on, Dan. I'm glad you brought it up. In Psalm 22, the dual fulfillment thing, which I know we've talked about a lot, is a good one. I should have mentioned that. Like David was saying that, and it was applying to David. We're using it to apply to Jesus, which I think is also appropriate, but it is definitely dual fulfillment.
But it is in verse 13 of Galatians 3, Paul clearly says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us.
Yep.
And then he quotes again the Old Testament. So I don't, I didn't say, well, I won't argue.
Yeah. He does say that, yeah, and I kind of view that as he also became the sacrificial lamb on our behalf. He became a lamb, but he wasn't a lamb. He wasn't literally a lamb. You know what I mean? That's the point I'm making. Is depending on whether you're using that as he represented that, he stepped into our place. To me, that he actually took on sin, became sin. I don't know, but I understand what you're saying. There could have been something temporarily that was different, but I think the point you made is just like David knew, Jesus knew at the end he was not going to be forsaken, and to me that's the kind of critical point of that. But all right, let's get through one more. I'll try to get us through chapter 15, and then we will pause and let folks sort of make overall observations about the book of Mark. So picking it up in verse 42, it says, when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. and he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. So what do we know about the expectations around a burial timeline here? When a criminal was executed, you might know what the expectation was around when they would be buried. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 21, it says that they're really supposed to be buried the same day. So I think that it's just interesting to note because, when we look at the timeline here, Jesus gives up his life at around 3 p.m. and, sundown on the Jewish clock was the beginning of the next day, which was 6 p.m., which doesn't leave a whole lot of time in between. So I think that's interesting to think about as we think through what was going on here. So anyway, I'll open it up. What observations do folks have on this section about Joseph coming and asking for the body and that sort of thing? Yes. Yeah.
Regardless of the understanding of Tennessee or whatever that picture is, the truth of the matter is, he did everything that needed to be done so we can have salvation. It's astonishing to me that the curtain is torn and a centurion, one of the ones who was responsible for putting him on the cross,
Right.
acknowledged truly this man was the Son of God.
Right.
Because he heard everything, which was an incredible statement that we kind of passed by. He was a Gentile and an enemy.
Yeah.
But actually, he acknowledges Christ as the Son of God.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. The next step in the process, he says, okay, it's done.
Right.
And truly this man was.
And he would have been right there for all those steps along the way. So a firsthand witness. Yeah, thank you for bringing it up, Tim. We're going to talk about that. Right. Right. Which is interesting when we get into chapter 16 and that first verse says, when the Sabbath was passed, Mary went, they went to buy spices. So the Sabbath was passed. Now they could go buy the spice, right? So that's a good point. They were nearing that time and things had to be shut down. And Joseph, by the way, Tim mentioned the centurion right before this, but who was Joseph? He was a what? A member of the council. So that's interesting that he, which in another place I think we were told he was not consenting to what was going on. Am I dreaming that up now? I meant to look that up. I forgot to do that. Somebody tell me if I've got that wrong. I think in another account, we were told that he was not consenting to Jesus' death. So, somebody help me reconcile this phrase of, what does it say? He took courage and went to Pilate. And I know in one of the other accounts it says he went. Anybody remember that? When did he go? Or how did he go? Boldly. Which is that here? In one of the other accounts, it's another thing I meant to look up this morning and I didn't wake up on time. I think in one of the other accounts it says he went. Dan, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to mention Nicodemus too.
Good.
Nicodemus
Very good.
and John's the only gospel that mentions Nicodemus.
Yep.
He, remember, came to Jesus by night because he was afraid.
Right.
But then he brought later on, at this point, with Joseph,
Yep.
he came in and bought his body with like 100 pounds of
Yep.
oil or aloes, whatever it is that they involved him with. So both of these men became involved.
Yeah, it's this. Tim, go ahead. Did you? Right. They're called disciples. Right. Right. I think in one place it says that he came secretly. Does it use the word secretly? You might find this. I can't believe it. Somebody, come on. Somebody's flipping around in the other. Does it say that? John says that? Okay. I meant to write down. Now, isn't that interesting? So you've got in one place. So these two things have to, I think both of these things can be true. That's the question I was going to ask is somebody help me connect those two. He came secretly by night. He came boldly. He took courage. Anybody got thoughts on how we can square all that? Would it have been inappropriate for him to have some fear in this situation?
He was on the council, but the Jews found out what he was doing. He took his life.
Right, right. But even in light of that, he came, right? He still came. So that's courageous. It doesn't mean he wasn't fearful. It doesn't mean he wasn't being prudent about how he was going about things, but he did it. Well, everyone else ran away. And here he is, and Dan said Nicodemus as well. It's interesting. You see those things sort of like mixed up in a couple of those. Somebody doing something secretly or coming by night, but then we see other places where they're talked about being a disciple or having courage or coming boldly. So I just think we need to, in our heads, we somehow need to fit those together. And I think there's a way to do it, but it's interesting how they're combined. Yep. Yep.
So he was risking his reputation.
Absolutely. As a member of the council, I don't know if he was the only one, but I'm sure he would have been in the minority of the council that was not consenting to what was going on. So, interesting. Yeah, Tim.
Well, whenever John, he was secretly a disciple of Christ. It doesn't say he secretly went. This might ESV and the other versions that I looked at. The secret was he followed him.
Got it.
Not that he secretly went.
That you may be right. Yeah, I may have mixed up the. Yeah, I think the same. No, you may be right. Even if that's true, I think the same point can be. I mean, he was secretly a disciple, so that you could make the same point. Like he's still kind of hiding in the shadows a little bit, but we're told that he took courage and he did it boldly. So that's just. I know that's complicated how all that fits together, but it is interesting. Yeah, Dan, sorry, did I cut you off? Go ahead. Well, we're not having any more of that. Anything else on this section? I know we're down to about 10 minutes, but I don't want to cut this off. Anything else anybody wants to bring up here?
Verse 39.
Yep.
Not 39. Where Pilate was surprised he was dead.
Yes.
I think it's worthy of noting that the the Romans were experts in crucifixion, and they wanted to last long.
Torture. Right.
People see this would have to
Right.
violate their law. And it shows again, Christ is the one who decided when he was going to die, not the Romans, not anybody else.
I think it's a great point. I think Bob mentioned they offered him the wine to drink. You wonder if all that's he's not trying to elongate, stunt the pain, live as long as, which would have been our reaction, I'm sure, is to just try to take one more breath. His job was done. He was going to control when it ended. He was ready for it to end. And it came way more quickly than they were used to, and it surprised Pilate. So I do think that's an interesting observation as well. What else? Anything else here? All right. We got about 10 minutes, so we'll go back to where we started, which is I would love to hear from folks on just something that really struck you in the book of Mark. By the way, this doesn't have to be like some, brand new thing you've never noticed before. Folks in this room have studied Mark so many times that probably a number of you haven't had a lot of those, but I'm hoping that you've at least been reminded of something that you have studied before that maybe hit home and that you're going to take away. So we'll start. We'll see how this goes. We'll stop class early if it's dead silence. But if you have one of those, if you don't mind, just for this, if you don't mind, raise your hand. Jacob's got a microphone. Gail's going to start us off here if you want to come here. Yeah.
The greatest thing is.
Oh, hang on. Come on. Hang on.
Okay, I got it.
Following directions. Beth already told me you don't follow directions very well. Now we're getting more evidence.
Not expecting it. All right. He said he was coming.
Go ahead, Gail.
I think the greatest thing to me and the whole thing is the temptation of Jesus, and because I keep being reminded that we have a great high priest who is tempted in every way that we've been tempted, and never sinned and all like that too. And so, to me, that just strikes home that, we're all tempted, but we also always have been given a way of escape at the same time too. And just because we're tempted on one day doesn't mean, and I think it pretty well says, and Satan's anger went around until time. He just
Yep.
and so to me, that's a very important thing.
Very good. Thank you, Gail. Thank you for getting us going, Gail. Appreciate it, even though you're a little quick on the trigger. He's lingering behind you. He's coming. Marcia?
One thing different about Mark is that he does not start out with the genealogy of Christ,
Yep.
which is totally different from the others. And another thing is how quickly he goes through things. And 40 times in Mark, he says straightway.
Yep.
I thought that was interesting.
Very good, yeah. Straightway, immediate. It's the book of action. He's moving from one thing to another. Yep. Very good. Who else? We'll give him a workout. Hang on. Trey, you going to get another one? I should have thought about this process a little more. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, the thing that strikes me is we see, the theme in my mind is he's the king in prospect, if you will, at the beginning. But what we see is time after time after time, no matter who it is, the truth is what's important. His own disciples, the ones who were close to him, when they did something they weren't supposed to do, he called them out on it. He told us all what the price was we'd have to pay, and then he paid that price. He never equivocated on his message. It was always the same. And the determining factor was the heart of the person hearing, not, let's change the message so that it fits. It just strikes me that Mark's, point like to Marcia's point, the straight way. If you weren't going to hear, you didn't want to hear, he went somewhere else.
Yep.
He's the king. His word will be honored, but he also won't equivocate. He won't not do what it needs to be done, good or bad, to somebody.
Yep. Good. Thank you. Who else? Tim took a few of them in there. He had his theme, but we're going to say one of those, it's okay. Pile on, elaborate on that. That's completely fair. Doesn't have to be some like 40,000 foot strategic view, even a story. And I think Gail mentioned the temptation was one that jumped out of him. Are there other events, miracles, healings, or whatever that sort of struck you and that you'll take away from the class? Anybody? Clearly didn't frame this question very well. This wasn't supposed to be hard. Oh, and you're welcome to flip back through the book too, because if your memory is as bad as mine, when you see it, it'll come to mind, but just sitting there thinking about it, it might be a little harder. So, oh, you don't need a mic. Go ahead, Dan. You don't need a mic. Go ahead. We have had no shortage of comments in this class without the mic, so this is clearly a bad plan. All right. I'm not going to force it. We'll try it again. All right, here's your assignment for Wednesday night. Practice. We'll come back Wednesday night. I'm going to need to do the same thing, and he's going to stare at you awkwardly as well if we don't have comments. John, I know you don't need a mic. Go ahead, sir.
For years, from the time I was a little kid, I could just see the curtain being something thin that you could see through, and it would carry and so forth. In essence, the curtain was 3.5 inches thick, and it was so strong that you could hook a yoke of oxen to either end of it and couldn't pull it, tear it. But still, when the time came, that Christ died, and we through that death and through his blood had the opportunity for redemption and the ability to approach God himself.
It's a great point. We didn't mention that when we were talking about the curtain, but you're right. It wasn't don't think about it as like a curtain over your windows in your house. There was only one thing that could tear that curtain, not even a yoke of oxen, but Jesus could tear it, and he tore it from top to bottom in only the way that it could be done that way. So.
About that and how that gave you access to God. There's so much in the gospel that verifies that Jesus was born, lived, and was crucified, died, and was resurrected. He's there beside you.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you for that. Anybody else? I think that was just the first bell. Yeah, Jake Clark. Go ahead. Hang on. Oh, wait. They already put them up. They gave up on me. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm not afraid of either way, I'm good. But I've kind of grazed over the burial of Jesus and going back to Joseph being a prominent and respected member of the Jewish council. It almost seems like that is a crucial point that needs to be made. The council themselves in another account went before Pilate and said, "We are worried because the deceiver has said that he will be raised after 3 days, so we want you to guard this tomb so that nobody has the opportunity to go and take Jesus." But
Yeah.
A, probably the apostles didn't have enough money for a tomb that Joseph had available to him.
Right.
And B, even if they did, it would probably be highly objected and probably wouldn't be allowed to happen. Both sides would probably agree. Think about that.
Yep. 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 All right. I'm going to leave that for Steve. We'll get into the resurrection account on Wednesday. So thank everybody for your comments. Appreciate it.